Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's conference under the title Cross-Border Regions, Neglected Nucleus of the European Union, ? For which we have been able to secure the participation of two speakers with the highest credentials regarding this subject. Marc Lemaitre, Director General for Regional and Urban Policy, or DG Regio for the initiated, at the EU Commission, and Karl-Heinz Lamberts, former President of the European Committee of the Regions, President of the Parliament of the Deutschsprachige Gemeinschaft of Belgium, President of the European Association of the Border Regions. The bios of the two speakers have been distributed, and without repeating the details, I dare to say that one can hardly imagine anyone more qualified to speak to us on the subject of today. It has usually happened, following the many wars in our area of Europe up to '94, that borders have been redrawn to reconstitute and separate countries in a way that suited best the winners of those wars. Inevitably, this separated families, existing communities, regions, and of course countries. The redrawing of borders was meant to maximize power and economic gain of the winners and weaken the losers, totally neglecting the local economic tissues and populations of the areas immediately concerned. The central powers forced administration, laws, fiscal, and often language rules onto the new-won territories and the regained territories. Local populations, not surprisingly, had a tendency to try and find ways to mitigate the burden of administration and fiscal rules. We all remember stories of smuggling and similar exchanges. Fast forward. Then came Europe, and that was cast over the founding nation states under which a common life and integration was meant to develop with decreasing national powers. Over time, this could indeed be observed on a local and regional level, and to some extent on a European level, most visibly on monetary terms, free movement regulation under Schengen rules, and a host of other European policies and initiatives. But national administrative, fiscal, legal rules are still held onto, and the governance and institutions invented and created at the level of the Großregion cannot overcome them easily. Two groups, however, look beyond such national thinking: big business and small groups of population on both sides of borders. Within the border regions, most notably in the Großregion, labor markets and exchange of small businesses have been able to develop in an encouraging way, brutally interrupted, however, albeit briefly, by the unfortunate national reactions to epidemics. Education is making big efforts to promote intercultural and supranational curricula. Cooperation in catastrophes has proven extremely valuable, and small advances can be seen in many areas. Looking at mobility, this has grown in line with the labor market in such a way that no public infrastructure has been able to keep up with the development. Further looking at fiscal and other administrative rules, they have never been able to keep up with needs and developments in the Großregion. This lagging behind has been amplified by the development of technology in the labor market during and after the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, I would be in no position to give you an even near full picture of the progress or lack thereof, and advances or the lack thereof, of how the Großregion grows together and how the positive developments could serve as an example of what could happen on a larger scale in Europe. Is the Großregion indeed a nucleus of Europe? Is it neglected? Should it be more clearly institutionalized at the supranational and European level and have decision-making powers in fiscal, social, educational questions? Is Europe or our member states holding up integration? Should Europe have authority in the regional planning process? I'm happy for our speakers to explain this and much more, and I invite Director General Mr. Lemaitre to take the floor.
Thank you for offering me support. I should be here. Lieber Herr Wöstmann, lieber Präsident Lamberts, dear colleagues from many European institutions, which I recognize in the room, lieve collega's en vrienden uit Lutzeburg, ladies and gentlemen, it's really an immense pleasure for me to be here, standing in front of exactly this audience tonight, to speak on a topic on which I had never dreamt of speaking. But it's such an immense pleasure because it in fact touches me profoundly because of my own personal history. And I'd just like to start by that, by sharing with you just a few words of why this place and this topic resonate so much with me. In fact, I was born around 50 kilometers from here. It happened to be on the Belgian side of the triangle of territory between Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. And as it happens, before I was even aware of my life, I was transferred by my parents to Luxembourg to grow up, hopefully, a few hundred meters from here, living on Kirchberg and going to the European school not far away. So, as I lived in Luxembourg, but with Belgian parents, French-speaking Belgian parents, in the 70s and in the 80s, I could observe what it was to go back to Belgium or to visit, which was a huge adventure, to visit, for instance, Paris, to go to see a theater play, for instance. And I remember extremely well, even though I have relatively vague memories of my childhood, every time we had to cross a border between Luxembourg and Belgium or between Luxembourg and France. It was pas une mince affaire, as you would say in French. It took time, and I'd like all of us to imagine how Luxembourg would be on a daily basis if we had the same constraints in terms of customs controls, in terms of controls of identity of people, with 220,000 commuters per day. It would be absolutely impossible. Back then, in the 80s, Luxembourg perhaps had overall 10 to 15,000 commuters coming from its three neighboring countries. And that is what allowed them still to pass through eventually. So I do think that we have to recognize that we have managed, for many practical purposes of daily life, to cancel borders in Europe, and certainly Luxembourg is the most potent example of that, with these figures that I have mentioned. It's very striking that, in fact, Luxembourg, with its 220,000 commuters and growing today, is the destination of, if I'm not mistaken, nearly half of all commuters in the European Union. So it's quite a unique, extremely concentrated phenomenon, but one which was really made possible, of course, by the single market, i.e. the elimination of all types of customs controls, and by the Schengen area, again, allowing to eliminate all controls of people. So this certainly should be celebrated and recognized. But not that long ago, and Hugo already referred to that, I think we were reminded in the starkest way what borders can be, can mean, and how disruptive they can be. Now that we have become used to living without them. And in fact, we had 3 extremely stark reminders of how disruptive borders are. The first one, which is still unfolding its effects, we haven't yet seen the full blast of that, is obviously Brexit. If you look at the figures, if you look at the queues of lorries between France and the UK, if you look at the collapse in exports from the UK to continental Europe in particular, I think that it speaks volumes about all the perhaps not so perceived advantages of this deep integration allowed by the single market. The migration crisis that might be returning quite strongly, which we went through mostly in 2015 and in 2016, was another occasion where member states felt that they needed to reintroduce strong controls at certain internal borders of the EU. And there again, it was extremely disruptive. Some member states still, on an exceptional basis, etc., continue to have these controls. If you think of the border between Austria and Slovenia. And Slovenia is complaining, rightly so, very heavily about that. And thirdly, Hugo also referred to that already, the pandemic. We saw the natural reflexes of member states, first to look for internal solutions and also to protect themselves before looking for collective solutions. I'm very pleased that eventually we concluded, member states together concluded that the solution had to be a common one. But there, again, Luxembourg specifically, because of its very integrated model, especially labor market model, saw how fragile that model was if suddenly you put into question the free movement of people. And by coincidence, it was also a sector in which Luxembourg is among the most dependent on commuters that was in the spotlight, i.e. the health sector. So I mention all this to say that first, we need really to take good care of the acquired freedoms, to really nurture them. And we should also continue to take a hard look at those obstacles in the daily lives of European citizens, which still exist and which perhaps are not so well seen and acknowledged. So clearly there is a lot of scope for further improvements. Let's think for one moment about French citizens, those living pretty much in the center of France, let's say Poitiers. Anywhere they want to go, north, south, east, west, will be familiar to them, and they will certainly have no particular administrative boundaries to overcome in their practical choices. But if you move east to, for instance, Mulhouse, where you have Germany to the east and Switzerland to the south, things can already become more complicated if you decide to indeed look around in a 360 degrees way to have the best opportunities in your daily life. I'd like to mention a few very trivial examples which exist today in the European Union and which can make one smile, but I hope it would also reflect on what we can still do to make Europe a more vivid reality for citizens living close to borders. If I take the border between Portugal and Spain, there are two villages on each side of the border which are separated only by 200 meters. But they are two separate villages, two administrations, and under two separate sets of national rules. Well, you would imagine that given that it's in touching reach, kids, for instance, would go to same places, not only for education, but also for their leisure, playgrounds, cinemas, whatever. Well, between Spain and Portugal, for minors to go from one side to the other without being accompanied by an adult, they need an authorization. And that authorization needs to be officialized by an authority to be able to go alone without parents to the other side. So this makes things already slightly less easy than geography would suggest. Take a very real situation on the French-German border. You, of course, have many such places as well, where the municipality on the other side perhaps has infrastructure which is not present on, in this case, the French side, and which would come in extremely handy. I'm speaking of a swimming pool. The French side wanted its school children to go once a week to the swimming pool on the German side. The problem was that on the German side, not only was there a swimming pool, but there was also a lifeguard, but the lifeguard had a German certificate. And that certificate was not recognized by the Éducation nationale. And so there was no way that French children could be under the watch of this manifestly not qualified person on the German side. And there again came in the example I provided to you before. The children individually needed the authorization of their parents to go to the other side. This was resolved eventually, because indeed the French and the German administrations recognized the absurdity of the situation, and they found a pragmatic solution. And this is something I will come back to. The search and perhaps the foundations for more systematic, pragmatic solutions for such situations in Europe. A third example involves again France, and I'm sorry, I think it is the geography of France, which means that there are so many examples involving France, and here it is on the Franco-Spanish border. There is a hospital which was in fact supported by European funding in the Pyrenees. It happens to be on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees, but nearly on the border, which is meant to serve populations on both sides. So the approach was perfect, but again, there was a practical problem when it comes to the ambulances of that hospital. Because the ambulances on the French side and on the Spanish side, you will not be surprised, have to respect different requirements. When it comes to the tonality of the siren, when it comes to the medicines that they are allowed to embark on those ambulances, because some medicines are seen in one or the other member state as narcotic products and are not allowed to be transported. So what was the solution there? Well, to have 2 fleets of ambulances, one to bring patients from France, one to bring patients from Spain. Again, I would suggest a pretty obvious example of serious and unreasonable inefficiency. We have finally, I would say, embarked more seriously on our environmental challenges. And cities across Europe are introducing more and more stringent air quality measures. And part of that is to impose limitations on cars which are heavily polluting. And to control that, well, very often they introduce vignettes or things of that type in order to prove that your car is of the low pollution kind and therefore can enter into the low pollution zone. And this is a situation which exists more and more, both in France and in Germany again. The city of Strasbourg has introduced a vignette which is called Critère. In order to get that vignette, well, you have a site which exists only in French, unsurprisingly. And it's not that obvious for those in Kiel or beyond to get hold of that vignette if they want regularly to visit Strasbourg. And we are in a situation today where French vignettes, so for instance the one used in Strasbourg, are recognized in Germany, but German vignettes are not yet recognized in France. Those who know that border well will also recall that, in fact, the train systems between the two countries were not compatible, and that therefore, in order to go by train between France and Germany, you had to change trains sometimes twice. Sometimes you had a special small train just to do a few kilometers across the border, and then you could hop on the normal train again on the other side. Thanks to another European project, in fact, this will be now history because we finally have trains which can handle the different technical requirements on the different sites. So, what does that suggest? I think it suggests that there are many, many more obstacles than we think a priori. And secondly, that these obstacles should find a solution in earnest, especially given the maturity of European integration, the general trust between the different member states. And so we should really look to find some solutions. Now, I do want to give you, because of course, it's not all bleak, far from it, a few examples of very successful and relatively simple projects of cross-border cooperation which really made an impact on the citizens of those regions. The first one is going back to this Cordania hospital in the Pyrenees. In fact, it really changed the life and also the feeling of security of the people on the French side. And we are talking about several tens of thousands of people who, in fact, were pretty much isolated from the French health system and had, when they really needed a hospital, had to bet on going to Perpignan, which was between 1 and 2 hours away. So this was really a life changer for them, and that was thanks to joint planning and much more effective planning between France and Spain. The health sector is, I think, endless in such examples. There is a second one in the north of France. You might know the region. It's not that far away from here, in the French Ardennes. There is a small place, Givet, which faced the same kind of long distance to the nearest French hospital, while Dinan is only 20 minutes away. Well, here, France and Belgium again worked very well together in order to allow general practitioners, which are in short change on the French side, to come from Dinan occasionally in order to help out. And Belgium opened up the hospital in Dinan to that French population. So here I'd like to zoom in on one topic which has been carried very much by Luxembourg, in fact. And I want to say this, in all objectivity. It is not because I happen to hold a Luxembourg passport that I say it, but it is because I witnessed this. Luxembourg, together with France, has been pleading to find a legal base at European level which would really allow member states bilaterally to look at all those irritants and border obstacles. And other member states were kindly listening or skeptical. And so Luxembourg and France turned to the European Commission to ask, well, couldn't you propose something? And the European Commission did propose a legal instrument based on, in fact, the article on economic, social, and territorial cohesion of the treaty, to set up a mechanism which would have been very simple in its principles. And it was that if one authority, at whichever level, could be a municipality, could be a region, could be the national government, raised an issue with some cross-border activities, the member state on the other side would have to examine the issue, enter into a dialogue, and see together whether something could be done about it. And one very concrete approach, which was suggested in that proposal, was in fact that it would be possible in a simplified form, not by going through international agreements which have to be ratified by 2 national parliaments, in a simplified form to agree that, for instance, the rules, the norms, the standards, whatever it was, of one side of the border could be applicable for the specific purpose that was the object of the irritant to that other side of the border. So quite revolutionary indeed, because it means that the norms which are valid within the territory of one member state, or possibly even only at municipal level of one member state, could produce legal effects on the other side of the border, but for a very specific purpose. Now, if you take all these examples, right, I mean, of ambulances, of swimming pools, of trains, of tram lines, which run across borders, it's easy to imagine how you could really sweep away all these problems. If you agree, okay. Well, we take for the ambulances of that hospital, we take the rules of Spain, and they are okay to also use these ambulances on the French side. What we also foresaw was that there was no obligation of results. So the dialogue could also end up in one of the two member states concerned saying, no, sorry, too touchy for me, I'm not interested, and I refuse to apply, for instance, this solution. Well, in Council, until now, we have not managed to rally around the necessary majority of member states to see such a mechanism being rolled out across Europe. We have not lost faith. Certainly, we have faith in the purpose, in the goal. The proposal is now 4.5 years old. In comparison, it's not that old. If you think about, I don't know, the European patent, how long did that take? Or the statute of the European Society. So we certainly have not lost faith, all the more so as the European Parliament, which is co-legislator on that proposal, wants, through an own initiative report, to revive it and to invite the Commission to possibly revisit its contents to have a second go. So this is where we are on this. I on purpose did not speak about money because I really wanted to emphasize my profound belief that when it comes to cross-border cooperation, it is more a question of mentality. It is a question of openness towards the neighbor who happens to live on the other side of the border. And it is a question of wishing indeed to facilitate things for your citizens, but also being willing to listen to how you could facilitate the life of the citizens on the other side. And we believe at the Commission that such an instrument as the one I have depicted would help enormously in that never-ending process of getting to know your neighbor on the other side of the border and putting trust in your neighbor on the other side of the border. That should be really helped and stimulated for the sake, ultimately, of European integration. Now, I could speak to you about money as well, but European cross-border cooperation is certainly fueled by quite a bit of money. It represents around 10 billion euros over a 7-year period. So it can and it does finance very worthwhile, concrete, for instance, infrastructure projects, which are useful. And I mentioned these examples. But again, I think that one shouldn't boil things down to that. What I would mention in that particular context of cross-border programs, and again, I think Luxembourg and the Grande Région around Luxembourg, which benefit from one specific program, which will be allotted around 300 million euros for the coming 7 years, they are a good example of seizing the new accents that we have proposed to embed in these programs. And these new accents are again about what I have spoken before. It's about the mentality and the way to work together in those border areas. We have proposed that there should be a bit of seed money, a bit of funding to go to governance questions of cross-border regions. And the Grande Région program has really embraced this by in fact allocating more than 10% of that amount I've mentioned to improve the governance within the Grande Région. So, to cut it short, are cross-border regions, forget about that title, I like the title you gave, the organizers gave today, are they really a neglected nucleus? I do certainly think so. European integration has to make further progress, and not only on the big questions which are the order of today. Of course, the Green Deal, our climate ambitions, are essential. Developing a more integrated, common energy policy based on solidarity between the member states, essential. The pandemic has shown how essential it is to look for common solutions, to have vaccines much faster, and not by competing with each other, but by, in fact, being a monopsony, and by being a very powerful buyer. And this is now what we want to do in energy too. But this is not enough. We should not be blind to what European citizens see in their daily lives, and where Europe and member states in their bilateral relations could really help them. So cross-border cooperation should really be focused, first and foremost, on making the life of what is ultimately 1/3 of the European population living in border regions easier, on giving border regions, again, Luxembourg, shining example, a much stronger growth perspective, on ultimately improving the single market, and last but certainly not least, on reinforcing the trust and confidence among the citizens of Europe. So I really hope that we will be moving further towards a Europe without internal obstacles, and long live European integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very encouraging. Mr. Lemaitre, would you like to give us your vision now and fire up the discussion afterwards? Thank you.
Cher Monsieur Wusman, cher Monsieur Lemaitre, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me today. Not because I like to speak English, because I prefer French and German, but to give me the opportunity to speak about all my life. I am now near to the end of my political life. I am in politics for more than 50 years. And all this time, was concerned by cross-border cooperation. And even all my life was cross-border. I come also from a region near to the Belgian-German frontier that changed 4 times in the last century. My grandfather was born as German, then he became Belgian, then he became German, and then he became again Belgian without leaving his little village. And also my life was really influenced by these 3 currencies I had to have in my pockets if I was around my home place. And even my first stereo installation was smuggled from Germany to Belgium. And it was not so easy, but I arrived. And there is no danger that justice will come back to it because it is a long time ago. So as Etienne Delaunay knows it very well. But in the German-speaking community, this little federal entity of Belgium, but I will not speak about internal Belgian problems today because I had all the days the opportunity to discuss with other presidents of the Belgian parliament, and we have many parliaments about some issues. But in my little region, on the eastern part of Belgium, all issues are transborder issues. With Netherlands, with Germany, with Luxembourg, and even also with the parts on the other side of the linguistic frontier in Belgium. That is sometimes really more difficult to pass than the state frontier. And so I can say I have some experiences and also very much opportunities, and I can repeat stories so as Marc Lemaitre did it in a very excellent way. I even know some of the same situations, and it is exciting. And it is also a never-ending story. But it is very important because it is really the nucleus of the European integration. Is it a neglected nucleus? I think so. But you know, it is always exciting to be a hidden champion. And in the region we are living here, we are concerned, we are near to 3 transborder structures. We have the greater region. The nuances are interesting. In English, you say greater region. In German, you say Großregion. If you speak gross in German is always a little bit suspect. And in French, you say grande région. I think the greater is very British. So the same as we have with the European Commission. You have only high-level groups. You have never low-level groups. And this greater region tried some years ago to find a new name under the presidency of the Saarland. Peter Müller was this time the minister president. We had 4,000 proposals, but it was not possible to find something else than greater region. And that means it's a very complex region. And you have really interesting aspects in this complexity. In the end of my speech, I will say some words about vertical, horizontal, and diagonal integration. But now I will give an example. A summit of the greater region is a meeting, of course. And you need a great table with all the participants. on the one side of the table, you have the Prime Minister from Luxembourg, and on his side, there are two minister presidents from Germany and 2 or 3 from Belgium. And on the other side, you have even more people. You have all the French diversity, the region, the département, and others, and sometimes, and always on the side, the prefect, the prefect. And then you start to discuss issues, concrete issues. And you will have very much requests on the floor from the French side. But there is nobody who can really decide something. And in the end of the day, on the end of the day, everyone has a look to the prefect. And he is there, and then things are done. And if you are the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, you can find it amusing, but there are limits. But that is the reality. You have a complex structure with a state, an independent state, with two partners with regions with legislative powers, as we say in European jargon, and you have a decentralized region. Now it is also not Greater, Grand Est, and then you must find the way to come to a conclusion. You have problems, you have issues, you have complex situations, but you never have the same capacities for decision on all the sides. That is the reality of trans-border activities in Europe, and it was very excellent that the Luxembourg presidency decided some years ago to start with this ECBM mechanism. It was not so easy to explain, even it is simple, because in reality, this mechanism is in conflict with what many people have in their head if they speak about national sovereignty. That is a real problem. And then you can explain, no, it is not so important, it's only a practical issue, but in reality, people have this problem. And it was extremely tricky. I remember very well, because it was during my time as president of the Committee of the Regions, to bring this question in the context of the MFF and the legislation and reglementation about cohesion. But we have seen that it was not so easy to pass, but we must come back because it is really important. We need such kind of instruments if we want to find solutions for all the problems we have on a daily basis in Europe if we are living around frontiers. And it is very important to understand that this trans-border cooperation issue is a core element of European integration. Because trans-border cooperation brings people to a real paradigm shift. Before opening the frontiers, people stand there back to back, looking in the direction of their respective national capitals, and then they turn around and they discover something completely different. They are staying face to face, and it is better to stay face to face than back to back, also in the normal life, normally. And this gives a complete new and different context. And this can also bring extraordinary enthusiasm and potentials. And often, this paradigm change happens in border regions where the borders were often very deep historically wounds of the evolution, and you must turn these wounds to strong wells of cohesion. And in Europe, we have this opportunity on many, many places. After Australia, Europe is the second smallest continent. You know it. But Europe is also the continent with by far the greatest density of national borders. And this has consequences, especially for European cooperation and cohesion. Dealing with borders, dismantling borders, overcoming borders are actually really part of the DNA of the European Union. It is essential for the survival of the Union. But we always also can see that if we have a problem, still the first reaction of states is close the borders. There is a real reflex, and even if we have done so much things, so much billions, this reflex is always there. And that is something, and reflexes are always difficult to change, but we must change them. But borders is something really fascinating. You find borders in all disciplines. In geography, with natural or political borders, in philosophy, in psychology, in medicine, and also in natural sciences. Particularly exciting is the examination of borders in astronomy and nanotechnology, which deal with the infinitely large and the infinitely small. And all what you can find in border studies through all these disciplines is very exciting, and it helps you also to understand the complexity of the trans-border cooperation issue. But for doing it, you must read very big books, but it is really fascinating. I can say it every day. I try to do it a little bit before sleeping, then I am sure that I can sleep immediately. And it is something I can only suggest you to do also. And the topic of borders is also very important in economy. For example, in the matter of the borders of growth. As the Club of Rome described many decades ago, there are interesting aspects to see that borders are not always something negative. It can also be a way to appreciate concretely the reality. But what is important is that you understand the diversity of borders. We have physical borders, legal borders, visible and invisible borders, and the invisible borders are always the most complicated because they are placed in our head. And in European politics, we have also important distinctions to make. We have the old and the new internal borders. And between both border regions, you can create formidable bridges, something for your association with a bridge dialogue. And I personally did it during many years with border regions in the eastern part of Germany. And borders can be approached in 3 steps. The first step is to see the borders, to discover them. If you fail to do so, it will be like a toddler who puts his hand on a hot stove. You have not to do it too much in your life. And the second step is to recognize, to accept the border, even if you don't always like it, because without recognizing these borders, you cannot create a useful basis for exchange and cooperation. And thirdly, you have to overcome borders, which is not always identical with crossing them, at least in the figurative sense of this word. Overcoming borders is what is actually exciting and relevant, and what ultimately matters. Cross-border cooperation is needed to overcome borders, and this success depends on three conditions. Firstly, one must be allowed to cooperate across borders, and it is not always evident. For example, on the Russian and Ukrainian border, in the context of the European associations of border regions, where I have the pleasure to share, we had strong cooperations between in border regions between Russia and Ukraine. But today it is completely destroyed, and even people was killed who was active in this cooperation. And I was very impressed by that's what happens now in the region of Kursk, where we had some years ago our annual meeting with IBR. And I was also very impressed this year when we had our meeting in Novi Sad with activities in Szeged in Hungary and in Timisoara in Romania. And then we had to travel to these 3 places. And that remembered me really the time I was living in my own region when the frontiers was closed. You must have this experience to understand and to let understand by young people what it means, open borders and closed borders. But this is very, very important. You must be allowed to go to the other side of the border. And then you must also really want to cooperate. And not only in a Sunday speech, but in reality. Because cooperating means also make compromises. It cannot be something that is only unilateral, especially in regions where you have asymmetric situations. And we will certainly discuss further this evening about the situation around Luxembourg. So I will not speak about it here, and certainly not about my report on taxation of commuters. It is something that is very, very delicate but important. But you must be convinced that on the end of the day, it is better to cooperate than to be in a conflict. And you must bring the people along on it. If you go too fast, you can arrive as political person somewhere in a political graveyards. And I know graveyards full of politicians who wanted to cooperate too quickly across borders, but did not take their citizens with them sufficiently, and were therefore voted out of office. And the third condition is the most important. it is not enough to be allowed or to want it really. You must also be able to do it. And so as it is in many other aspects of the life, it is not enough to be allowed or to want to do in order to be able to do it. Being able to work together across borders is a great challenge that requires a high degree of intercultural communication competence. Interkulturelle Kommunikationskompetenz in German. And to master this, it is not enough to take a foreign language course or an advanced etiquette course. And there is a wonderful expression in German. Interkulturelle Kommunikationskompetenz ist mehr als ein Fremdsprachenkurs oder eine Fettnäpfchenlehre für Fortgeschrittene. And if I use this citation with interpreters, and after the meeting I always ask them, how did you translate Fettnäpfchenlehre? In order to successfully practice intercultural communication competence, you must understand the situation of your neighbor even better than he understands it himself. And you must really know what happens in the other side of the border. And even in places where the languages are identical, and even more so where this is not the case, this proves to be a very great challenge because one has to deal intensively with the differences in mentalities, administrative and economic structures, as well as the circumstances and living conditions on the other side of the border. A simple example. We are here in a building of a Chamber of Commerce and Industries. In German, in English, in Netherlands, in French, it's always the same name. Chambre de Commerce et d'Industrie, Industrie- und Handelskammer. But if you put people together from Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium, coming from Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and if they didn't analyze correctly before what are the competences and activities, then they will have a dialogue without a real chance to have something as a conclusion, because these structures have completely or largely different missions and functions. And you must also know that even if you have successes in cooperation, in transborder cooperation, they can be temporary. Even where we have come very far with cooperation, we experience relapses again and again. For example, as soon as there is a bigger problem in the Union, so as terrorist attacks, refugees flows, or COVID pandemic, so as I said, the first reaction of states is to close the frontiers. This may be understandable, but in most cases it is not the right solution. However, it destroys a lot of what has been built up over decades of work and initiatives. And we have seen it, for example, with Brexit. I was sometimes in the border region between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and it's dramatically what you can see there. And we have also seen it during the pandemic. Even in the German-French, Luxembourg, Belgian-German frontier, you had reactions and perceptions and stereotypes who came from the past, who came again, and it is a very, very dangerous aspect. And then a last reflection for bringing you to a deeper understanding of trans-border cooperation. I want to mention that we know 3 generations of trans-border cooperation. The first is the most spectacular and can be found everywhere in Europe for obvious reasons. Obstacles are being removed, barriers are being thrown up, border security installations are being eliminated, border fences are being cut, walls are being destroyed, tunnels or bridges are being built. The border is opened because the obstacle is destroyed. That is a very exciting moment. But for many people, this moment brings also a deep misunderstanding. Because they believe, and it was a long time the case before the period of Mr. Lemaitre in the European Commission. We had this reaction, no, we have no further borders, so there are no obstacles, and all the things that happen, you can organize them yourselves on the ground. No, it is completely wrong. In reality, the things are not done if the obstacle disappears. No, in reality, they begin because people walk across the border, then exchanges arrived, and mobility is concretely practiced. And this brings us a series of new problems, because when people cross the border, often without realizing it, they enter in another legal system and then suddenly realize that some things are completely different there, and they don't have the possibility to adapt early enough their attitude. Incompatibilities appear then and often in an unexpected way. And after every problem resolved, they will have other problems, because you resolve one problem, then you have more mobility, and there are coming new problems. So it is something interesting for people working in the cross-border cooperation, because as long as there is funding for their work, they will never become unemployed. It is the same as the undertakers and the hairdressers, who also never run out of customers. And then we have the situation that we must solve problems. And the Commission gave a very important mission to IBR as a B-Solutions project. So we have to identify obstacles and the possibilities to eliminate them. And that is very interesting to see what kind of obstacles we have. The Commission did also some years ago a very important research on this issue. And then we see that we have an enormous list of problems. Even the reports are very big documents. I have one on the place there. It was too big to bring to here, so otherwise I can show it to you. And these problems cannot be resolved always by harmonization. You must find practical solutions, also what is named in German kleiner Amtsweg, pragmatical solutions. And we observed, and that is a strong argument for the ECBM we mentioned some times ago, more than half of these obstacles should be easier to resolve if we have this instrument of transborder mechanism. So we must continue, and we have all the examples to go on this way. And this second generation of transborder cooperation is not so spectacular than the first one, where the borders disappear. But it is very important, and there you have to make each day your activities, and you must progress step by step. And that is what happens also in the Greater Region or in the Euregion Meuse-Rhine and in all the other 200 transborder structures we have around Europe, if we take into account the Euro of the Council of Europe and not of the European Union. And then we have a last moment, a last step. If you have enough pragmatic solutions, then you can go a step on and you can try to create truly integrated cross-border regions, functional regions, bassin de vie in French, and you can try to bring structures that can solve the problems in a systematical way, and they can manage the problems without bringing all these problems on the table when activity is only done by the national side. But that is a very, very complicated moment. We are in this situation now in the Greater Region, but you have there the problem that it is not enough to speak about activities and missions. You must also speak about competences. And then you have again the problem with the principle of national sovereignty, and that is not so easy. And there, the European Union did a very important step in 2006 with the EGTCs, and an instrument that facilitates the creation of such structures. And the Greater Region is such a structure with a permanent secretariat, and that is a great progress that was done since 2095, the moment where the Greater Region was created. So there we have very, very interesting perspectives. And so as I tried to explain to you, the border, the frontiers, the boundaries, in English you have also very interesting differences between these concepts, is a fascinating issue, intellectually, practically, and it is a vital issue for the future of the European Union. And so it is completely correct to say that transporter cooperation is a laboratory and a motor for the future of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this excellent analysis. Where we stand. Let's hope you will join us here for the question and answers. I think there's a lot of flesh on the body now to discuss and to see what the audience online and live in the room has to say about the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you. I would like first to thank the Bridge Forum for offering the Fondation IDEA, which I represent tonight, to bring the opportunity to cooperate in this very interesting event. I don't see any questions online. Actually, I personally have more than 10 questions to ask, but maybe we can start with the audience. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français ou en Deutsch.
Thank you. Etienne encouraged me to ask a question. Lazarus Panurias, European Investment Fund, European Investment Bank Group. Many thanks for the excellent, very stimulating presentations. For a good solution, I guess we need a holistic policy that addresses all this, sovereignty, subsidiarity, etc., etc. But to limit to the mechanism that you mentioned, and if I understand, if it is to be applied to facilitate the cross-border, entails derogations from national requirements, which can be very welcome, let's say, for a municipality that is cross-border. But then, if that derogation comes into play, comes into force, what happens with a municipality that is not cross-border and likes this derogation? What do you do with that? Because, for example, again, if I understood correct, I mean, the ambulance, the hospital, the swimming pool, that is a derogation from specific national safety requirements, which, if they are derogated for the cross-border villages, can be very beneficial or very convenient for villages who are not cross-border. So where do we start and where do you end with that? Thank you. Sorry if I may continue. And I guess this, thinking further now, even if you, I mean, it could be at the very heart of a holistic policy. I mean, it's not just the sovereignty issue, it's also, I mean, within what you do. Thank you.
For this question, which I think goes indeed to the heart of how we believe we can try to make a sea change. How we believe we can try to make a sea change in this extremely complex environment that also President Lambert has reminded of, and that you have also alluded to by referring to these inevitable terms of sovereignty and subsidiarity. So how do we manage to offer a tool at EU level which helps member states through their sovereign decisions and through subsidiarity to engage in solving bilateral problems or difficulties that they face with their neighbor? Well, it is by not being prescriptive, but by just being prescriptive on one thing. You need to engage. That is basically the core of this instrument that we have called European cross-border mechanism, and we might have to even revise the name in order to get a second chance. The underpinning is exactly that one. There is a difficulty which is raised on one or on the other side of the border at whatever administrative level, and the other side has to engage. But we do not prescribe at what level the other side has to engage. It depends on the distribution of national competencies. As Mr. Lambert said, if you engage with France, there are high chances that in fact you will have to talk to Paris because, because the competency lies in Paris and doesn't lie anywhere else. But then, if I can call it that way, the beauty of that mechanism is that it is for the two partners to find the best way. And it doesn't have to be what I mentioned. What I mentioned was probably the most striking and the most revolutionary possibility that that instrument would offer, i.e. that the rules from the one side can apply to the other. But it is just as well possible to agree on sui generis rules. For instance, you have an international tram line between two member states. You say, okay, we agree on specific rules for that tram line. So the solution is not prescribed either. It's not to say you have to accept the rules from the other side. And then when it comes to the territorial coverage that you referred to, what about municipalities which would like to also benefit from that facilitation? Well, there again, it will be for the member state agreeing to an accommodation of its own rules to determine then up to where these apply, including geographically. That's what we can do in a context of, indeed, sovereign and sovereign member states which do cherish very much subsidiarity.
Let me just add maybe an additional question to what you just said. If this European cross-border mechanism ruling would be put in the deep freezer for a few more months or years, I don't know. It's not the best option. But wouldn't it be possible for two member states to apply the main principles and rules of this mechanism within bilateral intergovernments agreements like treaties? Or do you see this possibility? And maybe you mentioned France and Luxembourg, for instance, that were at the origin, at least Luxembourg, for this mechanism. Maybe is there a possibility? Is there room for that? Do you see maybe examples in some intergovernment treaties where we can apply such rule? Or do you see room for that?
There is certainly, in theory, plenty of room for that. I mean, international law allows for more or less anything which can be agreed between two member states. The added value, let me call it that way, we believe, of what we have imagined and put forward is, again, that there is an obligation for member states to engage. Not necessarily to ultimately agree on a solution, because that would again be going too far given their competences and subsidiarity. But they need to engage. They need to engage at the right level, and there is also a timeline within which they need to come to a conclusion, that either they find a solution or they do not find that solution. And this, because it would be a European regulation, sorry, I enter into a bit of legalese, which means that these are rules, basic rules, directly applicable in all member states. This, in fact, lightens the path to a solution, because you, again, do not need to go through national parliaments to ratify what would be de facto an international agreement on some exceptions to this or that national rule.
Thank you. Des questions de la salle?
Merci beaucoup. Mon nom c'est Christel Baltesler. Je suis prof émérita de l'Université de Luxembourg et moi j'ai suivi les discussions concernant la contre-région et merci beaucoup pour les pensées et sharing what you think about. My question is a little bit allied to the first question we heard. How to avoid the danger, I would like to say, that we create by overcrossing old frontiers, that we create new ones. That was a little bit touched by the answers, but I think, as you mentioned, that is a hard thing to think about. But when you are thinking about why persons are not so enthusiastic as we are here in this room, that is perhaps because I think what we have to do with this and how it could become more clear what is the added value, as you mentioned a little bit in another context, for all the people in and near to the equator regions. Thank you very much. And I would like to add a biographical point. I'm born in Saarland in 1,1956. And everybody who is a little bit familiar with all this history, that is very, 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 very clear to speak about now as person living in Trier, being 13 years commuter coming and going to Luxembourg. And now I'm happy to know what it means to cross border and how difficult it can be to create new ones by crossing the olds. Thank you very much.
Herr Lamberts?
Ja, wenn Sie aus dem Saarland stammen, dann werde ich Ihnen auf Deutsch antworten. Ja, das können wir auch, ja, das geht auch, ja. Die Problematik der verschobenen Grenze, der abgebauten Grenze, die dann plötzlich wieder aus der Asche neu entsteht, hat sich ja auch schon eben bei der vorigen Frage etwas ergeben und die ist real. Es gibt keine Wundermittel. Wir können hier nichts erfinden, ob das jetzt ICBM Plus oder Triple ist, was alle Probleme löst. Wenn wir jedoch diese radikale Konsequenz der Staatsgrenzen etwas aushebeln können für gewisse konkrete Dinge, dann machen wir große Fortschritte für die Menschen, die dort leben und die eine intensive grenzüberschreitende Aktivität haben. Aber wir werden natürlich irgendwo dann damit aufhören. Das gilt auch für diese Experimentierregionen, die manchmal ins Feld gebracht werden. Das ist etwas Ähnliches wie das ICBM. Dann entstehen in der Tat neue Grenzen, aber die Frage ist immer, wo sie entstehen und ob da, wo dann das Besondere nicht mehr gilt, die Mobilität noch groß genug ist, um das als ein wirkliches Handicap dann zu sehen. Aber es wird dann so weit kommen, das ist richtig, aber auch das lässt sich nicht wegdenken, nicht wegdiskutieren, nicht wegorganisieren. Das gehört zu dem Problem des Machbaren. Ist auch wieder so schön, irgendwo in einem Vertrag steht, if possible. Und das wird dann ins Deutsche übersetzt mit im Rahmen des praktisch Machbaren. Aber das Problem ist da, aber man kann trotzdem vieles lösen, wissend, dass man dann wieder neue Probleme schafft. Und dann sind wir wieder beim Totengräber und beim Friseur, von dem ich eben sprach, der immer wieder neue Kunden kriegt. Ja.
Auch Cross-Border.
D'autres questions de la salle, monsieur? Madame? Pardon, madame, allez-y.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. So tonight we were traveling in some countries in Europe, but we were forgetting a region like Western Balkans. So my question is, which initiative do you support? Balkan Initiative or Berlin Initiative? Thank you.
Monsieur le maître, est-ce que c'est dans vos compétences?
Je pense que c'est pour ce soir hors sujet. Vous avez une longue liste déjà de sujets que vous avez abordés, de ce que j'ai découvert à travers le Bridge Forum Dialogue, et un de ces sujets est l'élargissement. Alors là, ce sont les frontières extérieures de l'Union dont on parle et leur éventuelle évolution. Et on est là aussi beaucoup plus dans la première étape d'élimination de frontières telle que décrite par monsieur Lamberts, certainement la plus émotionnelle. C'est aussi mon expérience personnelle. Je n'oublierai jamais la chute du mur et les images qui l'ont précédé d'ailleurs, les barbelés qui sont coupés à la frontière entre la Hongrie et l'Autriche, etc. Donc, non, ça ne fait certainement pas partie de mes compétences directes. Ce que je peux vous répondre, c'est que l'Union européenne s'est engagée, on ne peut plus clairement, vis-à-vis des Balkans occidentaux, pour leur ouvrir la voie à l'adhésion, et donc ouvrir la voie à une modification de ces frontières extérieures de l'Union européenne. Mais bien entendu, il y a des conditions qui sont le fondement même de l'Union européenne. Et je n'en rappellerai qu'une, c'est, je connais le terme en anglais, good neighborly relations. C'est un processus que l'Union veut soutenir de toutes ses forces, parce que de cela dépend aussi la paix en Europe. Je ne regarde pas plus à l'Est, mais la paix au cœur de l'Europe. Et nous continuerons certainement, la Commission européenne, à œuvrer ensemble avec le service d'action extérieure pour que ces relations de bon voisinage prévalent dans les Balkans occidentaux et que les Balkans occidentaux puissent, dans toutes leurs composantes nationales, rejoindre l'Union le plus rapidement possible.
Monsieur Lambert.
Oui, si vous permettez, je voudrais juste ajouter deux réflexions, parce que je peux prendre un autre chapeau. Là, je parlerai au nom, comme président de l'Association des régions frontalières d'Europe. Ce n'est pas un hasard que nous avons fait notre réunion annuelle cette année-ci à Novi Sad, au Voivodine. On l'a fait même après une très difficile discussion interne dans l'association, parce que l'attitude de la Serbie par rapport à l'Ukraine, que nous voulions absolument mettre à l'ordre du jour de notre Assemblée générale, n'est pas la plus simple. Et je vais vous faire l'économie, en tout cas pour la partie publique ici, de vous raconter tout ce qu'on a fait pour éviter des incidents en la matière. Mais pourquoi est-ce qu'on est allé là-bas? Pour deux raisons. D'abord, fondamentalement, ça c'est une conviction personnelle que j'ai vraiment de manière définitive, les Western Balkans sont vraiment quelque chose qu'il faut arriver à intégrer à l'Union européenne, dans l'intérêt de tous les pays membres d'aujourd'hui, parce qu'on ne peut pas laisser cet espace blanc là au sein de l'Europe, mais ça c'est de la géopolitique, ça. Cependant, si on connaît un peu la situation dans les différents pays, on se rend compte que le phénomène des frontières nationales, nouvellement nationales d'ailleurs, après la disparition de l'ex-Yougoslavie, est un sujet extrêmement difficile et délicat. Et s'il y a un endroit en Europe où ça vaut la peine d'aller et de mettre tout son savoir-faire en matière de coopération transfrontalière à la disposition des gens qui essayent d'évoluer, c'est vraiment dans cette région-là. Et je pourrais prendre maintenant de très nombreux exemples. Et pour simplifier uniquement un, le nord-est du Kosovo, par exemple. Mais j'ai aussi eu des discussions extrêmement émouvantes et impressionnantes pour moi avec le président et le ministre des Affaires étrangères de la Macédoine du Nord à un moment déterminé sur ce genre de questions. C'est très important de comprendre déjà aujourd'hui que tout ce qu'on peut attendre et faire avec ces pays dans la perspective de leur intégration, de leur adhésion, ça peut être utilement appuyé et amélioré par de la coopération transfrontalière intelligente dès aujourd'hui.
Merci. Alors, nous avions offert la possibilité aux personnes qui s'inscrivaient de poser des questions en avance. Et un certain nombre de questions allaient dans une direction qui est très intéressante et qui a d'ailleurs fait l'objet notamment d'un avis assez important du Conseil économique et social du Luxembourg. Et cela concerne les effets de l'intégration à l'échelle régionale dans une région particulière comme celle du Luxembourg où nous nous trouvons actuellement. Et si je peux résumer certains des aspects du constat qui est fait, c'est que l'intégration, et ça fait référence d'ailleurs à ce que vous disiez, Monsieur Lambert, sur les différentes étapes de l'intégration transfrontalière, Le phénomène d'intégration qui permet la liberté de circulation donne un rôle un peu ambivalent aux frontières. D'une part, les frontières n'existent plus, donc ça crée des opportunités où on accélère les mouvements, mais d'autre part, certaines frontières existent en matière de politique fiscale, de formation, de tout un tas de domaines, ce qui fait qu'il y a un rôle ambivalent qui nous fait aboutir à une situation dans laquelle cette intégration transfrontalière ne génère pas systématiquement de la convergence économique et sociale. Elle peut générer même à certains égards de la spécialisation et de la divergence économique et sociale. Et ça peut aussi créer des problèmes en matière de financement des politiques publiques à mettre en œuvre dans ces régions de manière intégrée. Donc ma question s'adresse aux deux orateurs, peut-être chacun avec leur point de vue. Et ma question est, est-ce que vous voyez dans le futur des politiques européennes et ou des habitudes de coopération transfrontalière, la nécessité d'aller au-delà de la suppression des obstacles et de trouver des moyens pour créer de la cohésion, de la cohérence et de la convergence avec des outils divers. Est-ce que vous avez peut-être des idées? Monsieur Lemaitre, je peux commencer par vous.
Monsieur Lemaitre, vous avez fait un rapport, vous avez dit. Je suis très intrigué d'ailleurs parce que j'avoue que je ne le connais pas, mais surtout touchant à la capacité de financement des politiques publiques. Alors la question que vous posez est très vaste et je pense que le Luxembourg, de ce point de vue-là, est un cas particulier plutôt qu'un cas à partir duquel on pourrait réfléchir de façon plus générale au niveau de l'Union. Mais bien entendu, la manière dont vous l'avez posé m'empêche d'échapper parce que vous parliez de cohésion économique, sociale et territoriale que nous mesurons au niveau statistique NUTS 2 pour définir la politique de cohésion et surtout pour définir le niveau d'aide venant du budget européen à travers la politique de cohésion. Alors, le niveau statistique NUTS 2 en Belgique, par exemple, parlons d'un voisin, ce sont les provinces. En France, ce sont les régions, et d'ailleurs les régions nouvellement recomposées. Et en Allemagne, ce ne sont pas les Länder, c'est un niveau inférieur, je ne me souviens plus comment ça s'appelle, Kreis, Landkreis, ou je ne sais pas. Hein? Regierungsbezirke. Autant pour moi. Donc c'est très variable. En Italie, ce sont les régions. En Espagne aussi. Là, c'est simple. Je mentionne cela. Pourquoi? Parce que malgré tout, lorsqu'il y a un phénomène assez extrême, comme on peut le voir autour du Grand-Duché, eh ben, il peut y avoir un impact automatique sur la politique de cohésion. Alors je vous donne l'exemple de la province du Luxembourg. La province du Luxembourg, quand on regarde les chiffres, elle a un taux de chômage relativement faible, grâce notamment aux emplois qui sont pourvus par des luxembourgeois belges qui viennent travailler au Luxembourg chaque jour. Et si vous regardez les chiffres, en fait, il y a autant de personnes du Luxembourg belge qui travaillent à Luxembourg que de personnes du Luxembourg belge qui travaillent dans le Luxembourg belge. Forcément, ça biaise un petit peu le PIB du Luxembourg belge. Et du coup, statistiquement au moins, le Luxembourg belge est aujourd'hui, pour la première fois, une région dite moins développée au niveau de l'Union européenne, avec un niveau de PIB légèrement inférieur à la limite qui détermine ces régions les moins développées, légèrement inférieur à 75% de la moyenne du PIB par habitant de l'Union en parité de pouvoir d'achat. Vous connaissez tous certainement le Luxembourg belge, ça n'en donne pas l'impression. Eh bien, pour les nouveaux programmes de la politique de cohésion 2021-2027, le Luxembourg belge va bénéficier d'une manne qu'elle n'a pas connue auparavant, d'un financement européen assez conséquent pour ces, je ne me souviens plus exactement, 250 000 ou 300 000 habitants. Voilà, donc je vous donne cet exemple simplement pour dire que quand il y a des effets vraiment extrêmes, et à nouveau, je crois que le Luxembourg est assez extrême en tant que pôle d'attraction extrêmement fort, qui a un impact très bénéfique, je pense, dans l'ensemble, sur le niveau de vie dans les régions voisines, et aussi très bénéfique sur le taux d'emploi effectif dans ces régions voisines. Donc, je voudrais dire, pour revenir au point de la fiscalité, pour quand même dire un mot là-dessus, vous le savez, la fiscalité, certes, est un domaine dans lequel l'Union peut imposer des règles aux États membres, mais les États membres doivent s'accorder à l'unanimité sur ces règles. Du coup, sans grande surprise, et comme c'est un domaine vu par tous les États membres d'ailleurs comme un domaine naturel de souveraineté, les progrès ont été très progressifs, mais l'Union, malgré tout, est en mouvement. Pas plus tard qu'hier, enfin, les États membres ont marqué leur accord à l'unanimité sur le pilier 2 de l'accord de l'OCDE sur la fiscalité des entreprises, qui va imposer une taxation minimale de, c'est combien finalement, 13%, 15%, de 15% à travers tous les États membres. C'est une règle, merci l'OCDE d'ailleurs, c'est une règle qu'on n'avait pas réussi à l'intérieur de l'Union, de façon autonome, à imposer un plancher d'imposition des entreprises. Mais si on regarde les choses de façon objective au sein de l'Union, il y a des phénomènes de concurrence fiscale, par exemple, s'agissant de la fiscalité des entreprises, qui sont assez visibles. Si on prend l'Irlande, elle a une base fiscale extrêmement large. Si on prend Malte, Chypre, oui. Mais ce sont encore des épiphénomènes qui vont être maintenant auxquels on va donner une réponse à travers cet accord. Et comme c'était des épiphénomènes, ça n'a pas vraiment eu d'impact, sinon un impact très positif sur ces relativement petits États membres qui, en effet, ont bénéficié de capacités de financement public supérieures à ce qu'ils auraient pu obtenir autrement. Voilà. Mais donc, tout ça pour dire que je ne vois pas, moi, personnellement, ces difficultés à trouver des règles minimales harmonisées en matière de fiscalité comme une source majeure de divergence économique et sociale entre les États membres et entre les régions européennes.
Oui, c'est une problématique particulièrement complexe et nous sommes en effet dans ce que j'ai appelé tantôt la troisième génération de la coopération transfrontalière, là où les choses deviennent vraiment sérieuses, où on veut créer des véritables espaces de coopération transfrontalière intégrés. Et je voudrais d'abord dire que j'apprécie vraiment beaucoup ce document que le Conseil économique et social du Grand-Duché du Luxembourg vient d'éditer sous forme d'avis et qui s'appelle « Pour un développement cohérent de la métropole transfrontalière du Luxembourg dans la grande région ». C'est vraiment très, très bien fait et il y a 23 recommandations sur lesquelles En tout cas, je ne manquerai pas là où je suis encore engagé dans la grande région, à savoir dans le Conseil interparlementaire, de suggérer qu'on les aborde vraiment en commun, point par point. C'est vraiment un très bel exemple de cette réflexion à la troisième dimension de l'évolution de la coopération transfrontalière. Et alors, dans ce contexte-là, je l'ai dit tantôt incidemment, se pose évidemment un tas de problèmes délicats qui sont liés aussi au fait que, d'une façon ou d'une autre, très rarement, les flux en question sont complètement équilibrés. Ils sont souvent très déséquilibrés. Je pourrais parler de ma région. Nous avons beaucoup de gens qui habitent dans notre région qui travaillent au Luxembourg, et il y a très peu dans l'autre sens. Il y a quelques-uns qui viennent habiter chez nous, mais ça, on a aussi ailleurs en Belgique. Mais du côté de la France, c'est encore beaucoup plus intense. Et il y a un autre exemple, d'ailleurs fortement cité, analysé dans ce document, c'est la région de Genève qui a des expériences très intéressantes dans ce contexte-là aussi. Et on avait discuté de ça au Congrès des pouvoirs locaux et régionaux il y a quelques années, et on m'avait désigné comme rapporteur pour un rapport avec le beau titre « Une répartition équitable de l'impôt dans les zones transfrontalières. Compromis potentiel et possibilité de compromis ». Déjà, ce sujet est une performance extraordinaire. Et on m'avait désigné parce qu'on croyait que j'étais quelqu'un qui était capable de ne pas créer trop d'incidents en abordant ça. Mais je ne suis pas tout à fait con non plus, donc j'ai tout de suite désigné comme expert un spécialiste tout à fait reconnu, à savoir l'Institut ITEM à Maastricht, et je leur ai fait réécrire leur rapport 6 fois. Et ils n'étaient pas très contents à la fin parce que la rémunération, très modeste d'ailleurs, que le Conseil de l'Europe s'est payé, ne changeait pas. Mais finalement, on est tombé sur un document qui est intéressant. C'est 22 pages intenses. Je suis d'ailleurs très fier que dans ce rapport, à la note subpaginale numéro 8 déjà, on cite ce rapport, donc c'est vraiment très intéressant. Mais beaucoup de gens en ont parlé, mais peu l'ont lu. Et la personne la plus célèbre qui a fait ça, c'est le Premier ministre luxembourgeois, lors d'une réunion dans les commémorations de la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Il m'a une fois agressé devant le président allemand et le roi belge en disant « Qu'est-ce que tu as fait comme rapport là-bas ?» Il me racontait des cracks. Alors j'ai dit « Mais avant de m'agresser, tu fais mieux de lire le rapport et puis on en reparlera. » Mais depuis lors, on n'a plus eu l'occasion d'y venir à ça. Ce rapport a fait beaucoup de remous, alors qu'en réalité, mais il faut le lire jusqu'à la fin, et c'est 22 pages petites, étroitement écrites, donc il faut déjà peu de temps. J'ai essayé d'être vraiment très équilibré et très prudent, mais d'être quand même très clair aussi. D'abord, si on analyse une histoire comme la répartition de l'impôt, c'est clair que c'est tout de suite quelque chose qui anime tout le monde, et il ne faut pas uniquement voir les choses d'un seul point de vue. Je peux prendre l'impôt sur les personnes physiques, mais je dois aussi élargir le sujet pour avoir une vue complète sur les aspects de sécurité sociale, sur les aspects d'imposition directe, indirecte et tout ce qu'on veut, immobilière. C'est très complexe, mais il faut vraiment entrer dans le détail. Et ici, on avait focalisé sur la répartition de l'impôt sur les personnes, et on avait 2 principes. Premier principe, il faut éviter la double imposition dans le chef de personne. Ça, c'est clair, c'est tout à fait normal. Et deuxièmement, il faut arriver d'une façon ou d'une autre à avoir une répartition équitable, et là, tout tourne autour de la question, est-ce que j'impose dans l'État de résidence, ou est-ce que j'impose, comme le suggère l'OCDE, dans l'état de l'activité? Et suivant la formule que je prends, je dois avoir des compensations, et c'est là où ça commence à devenir très difficile, parce que ça devient vite un sujet polémique, mais en dehors de la remarque qu'il faut avoir des vues assez complètes, L'autre remarque, c'est qu'il faut comprendre qu'on a fondamentalement des intérêts communs à un bon développement. Et en cela, ce document est vraiment très fort parce qu'il vient des luxembourgeois eux-mêmes. Il faut du co-développement, comme on a dit. Il faut reconnaître que si tout le résultat fiscal tombe dans un pays, l'autre doit avoir un return aussi. Mais alors, comment le faire, comment l'organiser? Le mieux, c'est de développer des choses ensemble. Et là, à nouveau, notre ICBM serait vraiment une chose très, très importante, où on peut avoir d'autres idées. Mais il faut aller dans ce sens-là, parce que le Luxembourg a besoin de tous ces travailleurs frontaliers. Sans ceux-là, les Luxembourgeois ne sont pas très heureux. Et il faut dire aussi que tous ceux qui viennent travailler au Luxembourg, ils gagnent quand même bien leur vie aussi. Je suis bien payé pour le savoir, pas payé, mais les 3 fils de ma sœur travaillent tous les 3 au Luxembourg. Et ils gagnent d'ailleurs, 2 des 3 gagnent plus que moi, ce qui, évidemment, est honnête, hein, ce qui est toujours un critère. Mais bon, je suis généreux. Hein, et je ne meurs pas de faim. Hein. Donc, c'est quelque chose de très sérieux, mais il ne faut pas trop restreindre le sujet, il faut arriver à quelque chose qu'on fait en commun. Et là, je le redis pour la 3e fois, parce que je crois vraiment ces pistes ici dedans sont très très bonnes.
Vincent, we're approaching dinner time. I was almost going to say we're approaching the end of the event. If I come back to the title of tonight's event, Cross-Border Regions, we've heard a lot about borders. We've heard a lot about obstacles, disruptions, and we've had a deep and interesting and anecdotal also analysis of the difficulties we're going through. And I think we can note that there is an awful lot that remains to be done. And I will not try to propose a resume of today's or tonight's proposals. But if somebody is still looking for a word of the year, I might propose Fettnäpfchen für Fortgeschrittene, Fettnäpfchen Lehre für Fortgeschrittene. So if we can take this home and go to the foyer now for drinks. And before we close and I shut down the micro, I would like to propose to everybody good holidays and a good break at the end of the year and a good start into the new year. Thank you all very much.